Prairie deer hunting. We went just last week, Steve and I, and on opening morning, Steve got this buck. Look at that wide open country. And that evening, I got this buck. Imagine that, 2 nice bucks in the first day. Man, how did it all happen, Steve?
It was quite a story that I'd love to tell.
Well, listen, we are going to tell that story. We want to share with you today what we learned. We are going to cover whitetail behavior out in the open country like this. We want to cover the habitat and the weather and how that changes and affects their behavior. We want to share what rifles and ammunition we used and how things worked out that way. And what was the last thing we want to talk about? Tactics.
Tactics.
Yes, how do you hunt whitetail in big wide open country like this? How do you even find them? So before we dive in, though, you need to buy this knife. Let's not be subtle. This is the Ron Spomer Outdoors Magna Cut steel knife from Knives of Alaska, and I am really high on it. Steve watched this knife work.
I did. And I've never been as impressed with a knife as I am with that thing right there. So what Ron was able to do with that knife is just, I couldn't even, I mean, it was fun to watch.
He called me Zorro. Seriously, folks, Knives of Alaska stands behind this, guarantees this knife, and I think it's just the perfect full-tang sheath knife for general hunting. I used it to not only field dress my deer, but to skin them and then bone them. And I went through 2 deer before I even thought about sharpening that knife.
Right, and that doesn't include cutting up the sternum. I mean,
Yeah.
he was actually taking
Yeah, I went
that
through
knife
those.
and right between the ribs, right up to the brisket, and that's what got my attention.
So
after
if you
all
guys,
of that, after all of that, being able to do that with that knife, I was just like, holy smokes.
So if you guys would be like, pick one of these up, it's called the Classic Hunter. Go to the website of Knives of Alaska, and you should find it there. And they're telling me that if you order before Christmas, it's free shipping. And if this is the first knife you've ever bought through RSO, if you mention RSO10, put that on your order, or mention it when you order, you'll get 10% off. And I just think you're going to love it. Now, it's got a real special little deal thrown into the mix here, and that is your own serial number. Each knife will have its own serial number, and it comes with documentation. So I think you might enjoy something like that. Hope so. And say Merry Christmas with a knife to someone you love.
Yeah.
And if that's not enough for you guys, you can also buy my Predator hunting book and the 7mm book. Those are on sale for Christmas, 20% off. Is that right, Betsy? Betsy said 20% off autographed copies from ronspomeroutdoors.com. Just go to that website in the store, pick out a book, pick up a knife, and anything else that catches your eye. All right, now let's get down to business, Steve.
Let's do.
Was this your first prairie deer hunt?
Yes. Yeah, it was quite an experience. It was. I can't wait to do it again.
Oh, so you kind of liked it, huh?
I loved it. It's actually probably one of my most favorite big game hunting experiences was hunting out in that open country like that.
Yeah? Well, I've been doing it since I was a kid. That was my home country. And I knew you were going to enjoy it. Everyone enjoys it. Well, let me take that back. I have bumped into a few folks from back east who, agoraphobia, fear of open spaces. They get out there and there's so much sky and so much landscape and so open they just get freaked out.
Yeah, you can't see the end.
You can't see
you know
the
it's
end.
out there, but you can't see where it ends.
Yeah. So here's what we did. We drew some tags hunting on a ranch that was really only about 40 miles from a ranch that I used to hunt when I was in my early 20s. And so I knew the country roughly, what it would look like. But I was really impressed with this because we told you we were going to talk about the habitat and the behavior of the deer in relation to it. So the habitat is rolling plains. This was bison country historically. But down in the deeper draws, the runoff draws that come off of the low hills and such, you have ash trees and bur oak trees growing. Yep. In profusion. So you have wooded draws, and a lot of them you can't even see until you're almost on top of them.
Right, a lot of mast.
Yeah.
There's a lot of mast production.
So you've got oaks, but on the upper ends of these drainages, it gets a little bit drier and the trees don't survive, but the shrubbery does. So you end up with sumac thickets, lots of poison ivy.
Oh, that just shocked the heck out of me. Here we are out in the middle of the grasslands, and Ron said, "Watch out for that. That's poison ivy." I went, "What?"
Well, it's kind of confusing because the berries on poison ivy look almost the same as the snowberry, which is another common shrub out there, and you commonly find bucks bedded out in that stuff. In fact, that's where we got your buck.
It's true.
Yeah, we were far from all the trees, and as soon as I saw that buck and doe, I knew what was going on. And this is part of the behavior deal. Whitetail bucks will chase a doe and try to drive her away from her fawn, as most of us know, but the other deer as well. If he can kind of keep her from getting back into the trees where the other deer are hanging out, she will often bed down in one of these little thickets. And they're not tall enough to hide the deer. You can see either their heads or certainly the antlers sticking out.
Right.
Yeah. So as soon as I saw that buck out there with her, I think we were a good mile away from the nearest tree bottom, right?
Yeah. And one of the things I just wanted to mention is that you referenced being able to see the antlers. Whatever it is that they're rubbing on does not stain the antlers like you would expect. I mean, they're a lot whiter, a lot grayer looking.
And they really show up.
They just like, it's like a neon light on the front of a cafe when you see them at a distance. It's just incredible how easy they are to pick off.
Yeah, that makes it. It's just fun, and I think the reason that most people enjoy prairie whitetails once they've tried it is the fact that you can see them. Everyone who hunts whitetails, I think, is so used to having to wait for them to come within 50 yards or less in the brushy country and the wooded country that they're in. But out here, you can see them easily a mile away.
Easily.
Yeah.
In fact, we actually had an ag field that was probably close to, I want to say 3/4 of a mile.
About right.
Off to the south of us, and those deer were funneling out of the corner. And then once they got out into the grasslands, it was just like a spider web. They just took off and went everywhere to go bed.
Yeah.
And so having the opportunity not only to see the deer coming from that distance, but also to try to anticipate what direction they're going. And, there were a couple of bucks, one in particular that I thought I'd headed off, and it just didn't work out. But
they can give you the slip.
Easily. I mean, we talk about them being able to see when they're bedded out in the open like that, but there are so many undulations in the terrain that all they have to do is just step down below something, and all of a sudden you go, what happened? Where did it go? Because the assumption is I can see through this grass, and then all of a sudden there's nothing there. Well, where did it go?
Yeah. So I think what we're saying with this habitat being that open and where did they go and all the rest of it is that because of the habitat, their traditions change. What you expect a whitetail to do in wooded country isn't necessarily what they'll do out here. They respond to the conditions, which is travel a long distance to get to that milo field for the grain, and then travel back to a safe area like those wooded draws or the upper thickets, the plum thickets and the sumac and the snowberry, and then bed up there. And then you throw the rut into the mix, and you've got deer running out there like pronghorn.
All day long.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's all day long.
Well, what time was it when we got your buck, like 10 in the morning?
It was 10. It was a little after 10.
Yeah. So it's not like they just do their quick early morning movements and then they're bedded all day. They're still out there moving at all times of the day. We went out, I think, at 3 PM looking for mine and immediately saw a deer crisscrossing. In fact, the buck that led us to the buck that I shot came from behind us.
He did. Yeah.
And he was looking for some does.
And there was another doe and then another buck, a smaller buck that was behind that doe. And so we're just sitting there trying to decide what we're going to do, what's our play for the afternoon. And here comes deer, right in the middle of the afternoon, just coming right by us.
And that brings us, I think, to hunting tactics. We've got the country and the habitat figured out now. How do you hunt it? So the hunting tactics generally are, we started with getting high and watching. When the lights come up, you want to be up there because that's maximum movement. We're looking toward that grain field. We knew that was going to be a magnet. And sure enough, the deer are coming off of that. And then it's like, which draw are they going to drop into or which thicket are they going to bed in? And they were going every which way.
They were. All right. So we had the opportunity to watch this big mule deer buck is in the rut. And he had a group of does with him, and it was remarkable how tight knit that group of does was. They would not get out of sight of each other. They stayed together. They stuck together like glue, which is polar opposite from what we saw with the whitetails.
Yeah,
they were not interested in congregating. They were interested in safety and protection and distance and security.
Yeah, I don't think we ever saw more than 3 doe together. And it was usually does and fawns.
It was does and fawns. There was one time that I saw what I felt like was like an older doe with her, her fawn from last year and then her fawn from this year. They were hanging together, but that was it. If it wasn't a tight-knit, that family group, mother-daughter relationship, they just weren't hanging with the others.
But what was surprising, I think would surprise most people who saw what we saw, you'd get more bucks together than does.
Oh my!
Because they're chasing a doe, right?
Yeah, when you get one doe, and this is something I had never seen before. I hunted whitetails in hardwoods quite a bit, but this whole open country thing, where you've got a doe that's close to coming in, and you've got every age class of buck out there trying to compete for the same thing. And it's fun to watch. It's hectic, and it's just like the other thing that I noticed that the older bucks knew almost immediately if the doe was receptive, and if she wasn't, they'd move off.
Yeah,
they were gone. They were on the road, looking for excitement somewhere else.
Old guys rule.
They do. I can testify to that.
Now, when we come back, we're going to talk about what this does to antlers. So all of this competition between bucks for the does results in a problem that we didn't particularly appreciate, and most people wouldn't. And what was that, Steve?
Well, I think that the unstable condition for me personally was where you identify this buck coming, and then he would identify the fact that and they're pursuing these does. Like in one case in particular, where there were 2 does together, and this buck, and I was the biggest buck I had an opportunity to shoot, and he was on these does, but all of a sudden, there were 2 does that came up from the other way, from the north. They crossed paths. He started following them, and then he disappeared.
They went the opposite direction from what you anticipated?
He went the opposite direction. I'm sitting up there. I've got him. Yeah. I've got him at 230 yards for a broadside shot, and these 2 does come up out of this draw, cross across the face of this hill, right in front of this buck, and he goes, "Oh, that looks pretty good."
Wandering eye.
Off he goes, just like that. And I never saw him again. So that was the unsettling part of it. Having not experienced it before, you have preconceived ideas, and one of those is that once they got on a doe, they'd stay with that doe, and that wasn't the case.
Yeah, if she's ready or close to ready, they will. But otherwise, it's like, sorry, honey, I'll come and catch you later.
Yeah.
And they keep looking. But the point that I wanted to jump on there earlier, the problem that I had with all of this activity and the bucks fighting and looking for does was, what did we get for antlers?
Broken
antlers. Each of us had a main beam broken on our bucks. We switched sides. One of us had the left side broken off, the other one the right. But almost every buck we saw had broken tines.
I saw one deer
that wasn't broken.
Everything else, the one deer that I was referencing just a minute ago that came over the hill following those 2 does, had massive mass. He had width. He had tall tines, but his G2s and G3s were broken off the main beam on would have been his left side. And I didn't care particularly, but I was surprised.
Yeah. But it's common out there. But I don't think that's a product of prairie deer. I think that's a product of a lot of bucks. I think they've got a real good age and sex structure here.
Right.
Big bucks. I'd estimated that our bucks were 3-year-olds. They may have been a 4-year-old, but the bigger ones that we were seeing were definitely 5-year-olds, and there may have been bigger. Right. But the biggest buck you saw had to be a 5-year-old.
It was.
And the biggest one that I saw, I think, would have been a 5-year-old as well. But
you could just tell different body structure, the way he carried himself, the mass, shoulders to neck, and just the way he looked in the face. Mm-hmm. It was an exciting deer to see.
Oh, hey, Steve, I remember one that didn't have broken antlers. He only had 3 tines per side. That was the one down in the Oaks that about walked over us.
We have to share that story.
Yeah. But before we go there, let's talk about the wind. Because that's a huge part of this, guys. The Plains states are windy, and if you've never been there, you don't know what wind is. A 25-mile-an-hour day, that's kind of breezy. And then it gusts to 40. That's windy. And it goes all day like that.
It does.
Sometimes all night. We had 2 days in a row where it was just horrible wind, and you just get tired from being battered by that wind. And it ruins you can't shoot straight because you're blown around, so you need to get closer and closer and closer. And it's cold, and then the wind is making you even colder. So one day we decided to get down in those draws and see what was going down in that.
Was so exciting.
Yeah. But we didn't at first want to get in there. We figured that's going to be full of deer and we're going to blow them out and they'll run over across the fence to the neighbors or something. We were going to wait for them to come out in the evenings. And that certainly works. But after the second day, we already had our deer and we thought, what the hey, we can go down in there now and experiment, right?
We wanted to explore. I mean, the reality of it is you can think you know what's happening, but until you actually go look at it firsthand and evaluate what really is happening, because the forest is like a book. You know, I call it a forest, but these wooded draws were like a book. I mean, you could see rubs, scrapes, licking branches. You could see where other wildlife had been in there, where there's turkeys or whatever it was. I mean, you could see the evidence of that just because of the recent moisture and the confinement.
It's all right
everything's
there,
neck down.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just it's like you always hear about funnel points and being able to utilize funnel points, where that's exactly where we were, was in a funnel point.
Yeah, the whole thing is a funnel.
It was.
I mean, if you sat on one side of that wooded draw, you had pretty much a guaranteed bow shot to the other side.
Yep.
That's how narrow they were. So everything is concentrated, like Steve said, and we were walking along following these very obvious trails, and you would see where they were nosing through the oak leaves for acorns, along with the squirrels and the turkeys. But the scrapes down there, I've never seen so many scrapes.
Just one after another. I mean, there was this one section that we're getting ready to tell you about. Those scrapes were at a maximum 15 to 20 yards apart, and they were some of them were 3 feet in diameter.
Yeah.
And it was. I'd seen a lot of scrapes, but nothing like that.
And while we were drooling over those scrapes and saying, wouldn't it be fun to hunt here before the rut started, like in the bow season?
Yep.
We're still thinking about that one. But while we were doing that and easing along, saying, look at this trail. Look, there's some more scrapes up there. Steve says, and there comes a buck. And it was a good one. It was way past his ears. And
he was an older deer.
Walking along, looking for that check. I suppose he was going to check those scrapes we were on, but he was also obviously looking for does. We had bumped a couple of does before we found him. And then he came right up to us. We were just standing still, and he just stopped and said, wait a minute, what are those stumps? They're kind of ugly, but they're not moving, so it must just be an old dead tree or something. We're old, but we're not dead yet.
What's that moss growing at the top of that thing?
White moss? I've never seen that before. Yeah. But that, what do you suppose he was from? Was 25 yards?
At the most.
And then he went around us?
Never once, and the wind was absolutely perfect.
Yeah, coming right at us.
Never once did he display any concern at all. He was so focused on what he was doing that between his nose, he'd have his nose and he'd sniff, and then he'd get up and he'd look around. And then while he got right immediately adjacent to us, here came a doe, busting it down off the top, down through the bottom with a buck on her tail, and ran right up behind this bigger buck. And all three of them now are standing right there. Yeah. None of them had any clue that we were there, and we were standing out in the open. I mean, it was like...
Yeah, we're in any brush.
No, we just weren't moving. We had the wind and no movement.
And blaze orange, and they assumed we were a trunk. If you don't move in that country, I don't know, they look at you, you're just a trunk, a tree trunk standing there.
It was really an amazing experience.
Yeah, but the thing about that big buck and the small buck chasing the doe to him, I thought he's going to go after that little buck. He knew that doe wasn't the right property at this time of day. He's just like,
that's
you guys.
That's what I was referencing earlier. Is these older bucks know, whether it's a scent thing or what's a behavior thing or whatever it is, they know that it's not time, and they're not going to. Their window is so small, and there's so much competition. They are not going to waste 1 ounce of energy to pursue something that isn't going to profit them.
Yeah, and that's just classic stuff. You get these, I call them teenager bucks. They're just like we were when we were teenagers. Oh, there's a girl. Let's follow them around once. Maybe they'll like us.
Maybe.
Maybe. And the big guys go, wasting your time, kids. Go play. Yeah. So now that we've seen what these deer are doing and we've kind of got them figured out, how are we going to hunt them and what are we going to use to make our shots? When we come back, tools for the hunt for a prairie buck. Okay, Steve, people are going to ask us, what rifles did you use? What cartridges? What bullets? Give us the lowdown.
Great question.
What were you shooting?
Well, in my case, I was using a 1952 version of a pre-64 Winchester Model 70 and 270 Winchester. And 140 grain Barnes TSX bullet. Muzzle velocities right at 3,080 feet per second. Verified drop at 300 yards of 1.5 inches. I had it sighted in 2.5 inches high. And so 1.5 inches, yeah. But you can have all that you want to in a controlled environment, but the minute you get out on those plains with the wind whipping down those draws and coming over the tops, all bets are off.
It's the wind, and it cost us, both of us. We're going to get to the gory details now. Okay, Steve, before we continue with yours, let's throw mine out. I am shooting my new 757 Mauser, shooting 132 grain tipped hammer all copper bullet that was grouping as good as .4 with 3-shot groups at 100 yards. He was shooting sub MOA at 300 yards. Verified drops were right at around 2.5 to 3 inches. Everything was looking great. We were ready for making some perfect one-shot kills. But we didn't because of the wind. Oh my gosh. So Steve gets up for his buck and it's right in the open. We just came over this little bit of a rise and there he was in that thicket. What was it, about 250 yards?
It was 280 yards.
280 yards. Yeah. Easy shot. Steve knows his stuff.
Dunk.
And it looks like a slam dunk shot and the wind gets him and he shoots too far back and now we have a wounded buck. But he's in the wide open. But he's going away slowly with his rump to Steve. And Steve's trying for a shot, waiting for that opportunity. And then he chased that doe again for a little bit.
It was amazing to me that the least of his concerns was what had happened when I got involved. His primary focus was that doe. He was not going to let that doe out of his sight. He wasn't going to let her go anywhere. He was going to keep her right there in that thicket. And he wasn't putting up with her going anywhere.
And that went on for several seconds, probably even a minute, before she finally ran fast enough to get away from him because he was getting pretty well sick by then, before he finally turned to give you that finishing shot. But just before that happened, plunk, down he goes and beds in one of those snowberry thickets.
Yep.
And the antlers are sticking up.
You could see them, just plain as day.
So then, instead of fighting the wind, and I think what got you in that wind, as much as the deflection of the bullet by the wind, was the wind blowing you as you're trying to aim.
It's hard to describe, Ron, when you can't get steady.
Yeah, I understand. I've been there, done that.
I know that there's a lot of people watching that have had similar experiences, but that was a tough one for me. Really
but you called your shot. I remember when you were shooting and you said, "How did I gut shoot him?"
Yeah,
I was right on.
I was right on. I mean, and when that shot broke, it was in the crease. It was a perfect shot. And when you said gut shot, I went, "What?"
Yeah, you sure did.
No way.
You couldn't believe it.
I did. I didn't say it. I shouted it. What?
But the wind is what got you. But hey, all's well that ends well. And the smart thing we did when we saw that buck bed, we knew he was probably on his last legs. We just needed to finish him off. Right. And Steve very carefully eased over the top and got really close and was able to make a perfect shot right in the neck and the back of the head, right down the middle, and drop that big, beautiful buck. Yeah. Nice and wide, nicely broken off antlers.
But I was thrilled. I mean, for me, that was a real trophy. I mean, having the experience for the first time and being able to find a mature buck like that, I was very happy. Yeah. I was not the least bit disappointed in any way other than the initial shot.
Yeah. Well,
other than that, it's one of those I'll remember for the rest of my life type deals.
So that evening we went out, and wasn't it about 3 o'clock?
3 o'clock.
We headed out, and we were going to look at the areas in which we had seen some pretty good bucks chasing does in the morning. They were down in those oak draws someplace, and we knew they were going to come out. So we were sitting out of the wind in the truck up on the hill, just waiting for something to see to go after it. And that's when that buck came from behind us and ran over, and where he went, another buck pops up, and then a doe, and we go, oh, okay, we know what's going on here, the competition. And they're in, it was either a sumac thicket or snowberry thicket, a little of both, but
and a plum. There's a plum thicket right there.
It was short enough that you could see the antlers of the buck sticking up, and they were good antlers. This was a big buck. This was one of the bigger ones that we'd seen. Looked like he was probably a good 5x5 with some really tall tines and past his ears. We didn't put a spotting scope up. That's another problem with the wind out there. You put a spotting scope up and it shakes so much in the wind you can't see anything.
There's so much movement that it's just a waste of time.
But I knew it was more than big enough for me to pursue, and I said, let's go get him. We had the wind right. It was going to be quartering, and we just had to get over a little rise and into a draw where we would be then out of sight, and then get a little bit closer to them, keep the tree line between us and them. Now, these trees are down in the bottom, so it's just the top of them that are covering it, but that's usually enough visual block. And then with all the deer running around out there, we were worried about bumping something before we got to him.
Right.
And that happened.
It did.
Couple of times.
Yeah, we had a doe. There was a doe that was right right where this drainage bent to go in front of that thicket, and this doe came up out of the bottom and is just standing there looking at us,
staring right
what
at us.
What in the heck are you?
But I wasn't too worried about a single doe running off because with all that chasing going on, they're used to seeing that. The bucks will look up and they'll see a doe run across the side of the hill and go, okay, big deal. So I thought we could get away with it, and we did on the first doe. The second one's what got us because she was closer to that buck. We didn't see her at all until she was already running. And then it's sort of like all heck broke out. I had completed the stalk and I was within 250 yards. I just needed to get up on the hill enough to shoot over those trees sticking out of the bottom because he was on the other side. And as we were doing that, that unseen doe broke out of there, and then all heck broke loose because she obviously gave him the flag signal, and it was not just a.
They knew the deer that were actually in the thicket knew something was up. They just didn't know what.
Yeah.
So they came busting out of there to what
looking around,
what.
And while I was looking for that big one, our friend Jerry, who had gone out with us, who had hunted this ranch for like 59 years, did he say?
I think so.
He really knew the property and stuff. He was sort of our guide just to introduce us to it and all, and he had taken us back there. And he said, there he is, and he pointed, and at the upper end of the thicket, the doe broke out and the buck. And I said, is that the buck? Because I'm just looking with my eyes. I want to put my binocular up, got my rifle ready to go. And he said, yeah, it's him. Something like that.
Yeah, shoot him.
So I got into my sticks and went to stop him because he was chasing that doe, and it stopped
worked.
him. Yeah.
I mean, that thing slammed on his brakes like it's like a teenager at a stop sign you didn't see.
Yeah.
He's just like, what?
And I made several mistakes. One, I should not have shot. I got excited because everybody else was. Two, I did not confirm that it was the right buck. And three, instead of taking my time and sitting down, I was just in a kneeling position. And there was another one. There's 4 mistakes I made. The fourth one was I did not re-range him. I'd known that buck was 250 yards away, and then when all this stuff happened and he ran out, I just assumed 250. But in hindsight, the buck that I'd measured at 250 was at the lower end of the thicket, closer to us. This one was at the upper end, and it proved to be another 50 yards. Yeah. So I had the 300 and some yard shot, which wouldn't have been a big issue except for the wind deflection. I held for the shoulder, allowed a little bit for the wind, and just when I broke the trigger, the buck decided it was time to leave, and he literally took off just when I was shooting.
Yeah, that's, and we've talked just between ourselves a great deal about long-range shooting and about what can actually happen. And the second that happened, I went, that is why I don't shoot. And I'm not criticizing anybody over this.
I hear you.
But what I'm saying is that is a classic example. And that deer was close.
Yeah.
I mean, he's 300 yards. That's close, right? So he takes off just at the split second that the trigger broke.
Yep.
And it just, I was standing there in just disbelief that deer took off like that fast.
Yeah. I knew that instant it broke, and I saw him moving. I thought, oh my God, this is not going to be good. And sure enough, another gut shot. And then he ran down into the draw. Well, no biggie to go find him and finish him off. But I was disgusted with myself for not slowing down, taking my time, getting too excited. It's not like this is my first rodeo, as you can tell. But this is the real world, guys. No matter how experienced you are, you get together with your friends and you want to do your best, and you see this stuff happening and you go, I can do this, I can make this shot. And you just lose track of what you're supposed to be doing. This might be part of the explanation for why when we hunt by ourselves, we usually do better, we shoot better when we don't have witnesses. I think it's really kind of a in the clutch thing. It's just like you blew it.
I can tell you firsthand that the majority of my hunting has been by myself. And I haven't experienced the issues that I've experienced when I've been hunting with other people around.
Yeah.
It's just it's a different dynamic.
Yeah, it really is.
And it's not an excuse. It's just you have to have an awareness of nothing in terms of your demand to execute correctly changes.
Yeah.
Nothing changes. It doesn't matter what else is going on. The basics are still the same. And the minute you violate that tenet is when you start to experience problems.
Now that you mention that, Steve, I am guilty for doing that to you. Because on your buck, I saw the width of those antlers, and I knew he was a big boss buck out there with that doe, and I wanted you to get him, and I put some pressure on you right away.
But I didn't feel any pressure from you.
Well, I was
from
giving
somebody
it to
else
you.
that I felt the pressure. So.
I was giving it to you. It was like, shoot that buck right now. But that's the kind of thing that gets to you.
But here again, though, if you're not used to being out there and hunting in that environment, and you have seconds, and because everything is so exposed, those deer, by and large, are not going to stand there and go, oh, geez, try again.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work like that. And so you have this automatic time frame that you go, I have X amount of time. And this is exactly what I did, was I went, I'm not steady, but he's going to go. So, get the best shot you can get, and it'll be fine. Well, it worked out in the end, but it didn't happen the way that I thought it should have.
Yeah, and mine was the same. So I think we both faced the same issues. So we're going to wrap this up here in a second, folks. When we come back, we are going to give you the summation about prairie deer hunting and how we judged what happened and whether or not we're going to try it again, and just all sorts of fun things. We'll wrap it up for you, and maybe it will help you make a decision whether or not you want to try to go on a prairie deer hunt. Okay, Steve, given the success we had and the mistakes we made, how do you feel overall about that South Dakota prairie deer hunt we did?
It's one of my, and I said this early on, it's one of the most favorite hunts I've been on. Like I said, I've hunted by myself. I grew up hunting in the mountains, Rocky Mountains. Spent a dozen more years in Tennessee hunting nonstop for whitetails there.
Wait a minute, don't they have a closed season there? Nonstop. Game wardens, did you hear that? That's a confession.
14 deer a year.
You kidding me?
But just because I hunted nonstop doesn't mean I shot nonstop. Okay?
Oh, you were just looking.
Yeah, because I hunted with an old muzzle loader, open sighted 50 caliber or 54 caliber Hawken.
Oh yeah.
So I took a lot of time. But anyway, the point is, it's completely different than the mountain hunting. It's completely different than the hardwoods, typical what you would think of whitetail deer hunting. But it's unique, and it's open, and I loved it. It reminded me a little bit of when I was a teenager and we antelope hunted, a little bit like that. Not exactly the same, but in terms of what you're trying to accomplish, getting to high points and glassing and spending all your time behind a glass and not just walking and busting stuff out. I would do it in a heartbeat. I would go back. I would go back tomorrow if I could get a tag.
All right.
I loved it that much.
Well, I am going to join you in that, and I'm going to put in for a tag next year and go back if I can. To sum it up, though, I think my advice for someone prairie deer hunting is to don't assume these are going to be the whitetails you're familiar with back home. Think more along the lines of mule deer. You're going to be looking far, going to be glassing far. You can't expect to see them out in the open at any time of the day if you're hunting in November when the rut is on. You will have some opportunities to get down in some draws, most likely. In most places, there is a bit of that. You do want to look for a bit of agriculture. That really helps with these whitetails out on the plains. They can make it without, but there are going to be a lot more of them, and I think you're probably going to find bigger, older bucks with bigger antlers if there's a cornfield nearby, an alfalfa field or a milo field. Milo is kind of a relation to corn. It has these little beady red seeds on them that pheasants and sharptails and deer and everything eats that stuff.
Everybody.
Yeah.
Songbirds, everybody.
Then expect those deer to be traveling in the open back and forth from their bedding areas and their feeding areas. And then once the rut is on, expect them to be going anywhere they want to. You do have the option of getting up high and glassing, and I love to do that early and then in the afternoons as well. But early in the morning, be up there so you can look all over and figure out what kind of deer are in this country. You might see them a mile away, but you can always move over there later. If you see a really big one way out there, you know that's probably where he's hanging out, and then you can go work that area later. If you're not finding anything up in the open and there are some deeper draws, dive down in there. Maybe they're just not rutting yet, and they are sticking to the lower reaches. And obviously, we found a lot of sign down in those trees. I think we would have done just fine if we had hunted down there. Yeah. But I tend to like to stay in the open because I see more.
Yes, much more.
The first morning, what did we see? A half a dozen bucks, and a couple of them were really bruisers.
Easily.
Yeah.
I mean, I know. I saw at least that many, just me.
Yeah.
And that was exciting. That was so much fun. Just to, I won't go elk hunting and not see anything for days, and then go out here in the prairies and be able to see almost immediately, wildlife. And there's a lot of other things to see besides the deer. So, I mean, we actually saw an elk.
Yeah, we did see a bull elk.
We did.
And sharp-tailed grouse were just everywhere. We were wishing we'd bought licenses for bird hunting because Sharptail City. Wow, love those birds. Oh, hey, before we sign off, Steve, we probably ought to talk about bullet performance. You were using TTSX?
No, it's a TSX. It's a 140 grain TSX from Barnes for the 270 Winchester.
Mm-hmm. And I was using, as I mentioned, the hammer with the polymer tip on it. And, well, my finishing shot was a heart shot. He was standing across the draw at about 100, 150 yards.
Yeah, I'd say right at about 120 to 125 yards.
Yeah. And I hit him in the heart, and
it was unreal.
It was like someone had a tiny grenade in there. Just that thing ripped him up. Blood. Oh, it was. I'm impressed with those hammer bullets. They've always worked for me, and I've used them in, gosh, how many different cartridges now? 300 H&H, 375 H&H, 25-06, the 7mm, several of them, and it's just a great bullet in my experience. How'd you do with your TSX?
The TSX, I mean, I'm used to pass-throughs.
Yep.
With those things. I loaned a rifle to a friend of mine that he took his daughter on an elk hunt, and she shot a cow elk at 375 yards.
Wow.
While we were in South Dakota, and they recovered the bullet and showed it to me, and I weighed it, and it weighed 149.3 grains out of 150, and it was a shoulder shot, so it hit bone, and so I believe in those bullets. However, having been around these hammer bullets recently, I have to admit it's like these knives. I mean, you learn something new. And I've shot Barnes exclusively for over 20 years. And I'm sure giving this hammer thing a serious consideration because I sure love what it did on your deer.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is, on a gut shot deer, in the past, I would expect the bullet to stay in. It's always happened with traditional bullets. But these go through, even in that big wet. I mean, it's like shooting a big gunny sack full of wet alfalfa or something. Yeah. And it passed right on through. So we don't recommend taking gut shots.
No,
guys.
Please. Take my advice. Don't do it.
Yeah. And don't write in and tell us what doofuses we are. We already know that.
Here I am.
True confession time. Two old guys who've done this way too many times that we still screwed up. But that should make some of you who have made a little bit of a mistake maybe feel a little bit better.
I think the big takeaway for me was the wind. I have not had in recent experience the kind of wind that we had to deal with. And, if a true value wind with that bullet that I was shooting, you're talking about 6 inches at 100 yards. And you get 300 yards, you're talking about 15 to 18 inches. And we had a true 25-mile-an-hour wind. And so I didn't account for it. And it's one of those that'll never happen again. But unfortunately, like I said, it turned out okay. Disappointed, not very happy with myself. But in the long run, it's a good learning experience, and it's something I can't wait to do again.
Yep. Hey, and the meat's tasting great.
Golly sakes.
I've eaten some of it, and it is absolutely outstanding, as I assumed it would be. I just made another big batch of jerky 2 days ago. You might have to have some right after this.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, that's kind of our take on prairie deer. As I said, I've hunted them for years and years, starting as a kid. But the habitat has changed. There didn't used to be crop fields of any kind out in that western South Dakota country where we were hunting, and now there are. So there are more whitetails now than ever. Yeah. But the wind's still blowing.
One of the things that I want to add, and I think this is huge, is that we were on an active cattle ranch. And to the rancher's credit, there was no evidence of overgrazing anywhere.
True.
And that left habitat for all these sharptails, for the rabbits, all the songbirds. I mean, even the deer, were able to lay down in these prairie grasses and feel comfortable. And that is a testament to the right kind of ranching and habitat management. And we've been in plenty of other places where that wasn't the case.
Yeah,
and
good point.
It was refreshing. It was really refreshing. A compliment to the rancher.
Yep. And just to show how different it was, while we were driving out there for the first time trying to find this place, we saw some horribly overgrazed ranches. And I said to Steve, if this is the place, I don't think we're going to find any deer.
Right.
Because you could see the dirt.
It was like a pool table. Yeah, it was like a parking lot.
Fortunately, that wasn't the ranch we were hunting.
Yeah, as soon as we hit the fence line.
Bingo.
It's just immediately Ron said, whoa, this is what I was hoping for.
Yeah.
So
there you go, folks. Now, if you're interested in a plains hunt, you can do it in North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, parts of Texas. Those are the plains states around the 100th meridian. You get just to the west of the 100th meridian, and it starts to get so dry that you get short grass plains, prairies, but you also get that big wind coming down out of Canada. And if you are in Canada, you've got some of that same country in southern Manitoba, especially southwest, into Saskatchewan and Alberta as well. So there's plenty of millions of acres of land on which you have prairie whitetail. So check out the different states and provinces and find out what it's like to try to get a license. Here in South Dakota, where we were hunting, you have to apply for limited tags. I think it's pretty much the same everywhere, but check it out and get started. I think once you get your first plains whitetail hunt under your belt, you're probably going to look for more to shove in there.
I can promise you'll be addicted to it.
So thanks for listening to two old guys ramble on about their recent deer hunt. But boy, both Steve and I are so excited about this. We are already making plans to go back next year, and we might even do it with a bow and arrow. This is Ron Spomer with my good old buddy, Model 70 Steve. We'll see you next time. Hunt honest and shoot straight. And straighter than we did this last time. See ya.